Okay.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Amir Zuccalà. I will do a slightly different presentation that I made in other summer and winter schools, focusing more on some results that I think impact on methodology and also some reflections about social representation theory in a dialogue with another frame, which is the epistemic injustice frame. So I will speak about, of course, about my research, but focusing more on these two aspects. So the context and gap of my research is coming from a growing attention by institutions to disability, inclusion, and accessibility, like I might say everywhere, but specifically in the countries that I chose in my research, which are Italy and Canada.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I just forgot to put your presentation online, and there are many people who want to hear you. Okay, sorry.
Many people.
Many, like 1,000%. And okay, I have to restart it. Sorry. It would be quick. Okay. Okay. It's working? Yes? Perfect. Sorry, thank you.
So this growing attention by institutions about accessibility and inclusion, which produces frames of legislative and legal norms and practices and documents. I'm trying to investigate this according to what deaf people, because it's the target I chose, deaf people and deaf communities, to see if there's a gap between how deafness and disability, but more specifically deafness, is framed in these legal institutional documents and how they perceive their experience of being deaf, especially in deaf-led organizations. Because all these perceived gaps, I think there is a gap. I was hypothesizing a gap, and I think there is a gap. Brings frustration and the perception of social injustice. So my research is about these two levels. So I chose Canada and Italy. Why? Because they have a very different history and geographical shape, of course, but in the legal and legislative framework about disability and deafness, they are quite the same for some big principles, and I will explain later. So my research question is, how do deaf individuals, especially leaders of deaf-led organizations, construct their identity and the social representations of being deaf, and how do these differ from public policies? And what social representation are mobilized, because I'm using the social representation theory also, and how does deafness become constructed as a social problem? If there is a social problem, how deaf people respond in the same way? Do they respond in the same way? Do they feel there's a social problem? How and how do they navigate into the social representations of being deaf? So why this is important? Because I think if we become aware of this gap, if this gap exists, lowering this gap, building a bridge may encourage integrating like emic perspective with ethic ones, so bridging the two insider and outsider perspective. And this may support the design, hopefully, of more inclusive and effective social policies. So my methodology and data collection relies on a general qualitative research design based on an ethnographic approach, as Clifford Geertz called it in 1998 as a deep hanging out, like meaning there, being there with your, with the people, with the community, and with people doing things and thinking things and doing activities and reflecting about this. So I collected 35 interviews in Canada and Italy, 11 in Italy and the rest in Canada, mostly in Ontario, but also in Quebec area, in Vancouver area, in Manitoba, and other provinces, and in Rome, mostly the Italian ones. I also organized 3 focus groups on 3 different topics with 30 participants all, and then also 2 questionnaires online for Italian deaf participants, summing about almost 500 participants. One was about health, attitudes about health. The other one was about promoting sign language visibility and the perception of deaf people about sign language in public spaces. And focus group were about the use of voice and body, the sign language technologies and AI risks and benefits, and also the public visibility of Italian Sign Language. So the frame, the theoretical frame I use is the social representation theory in, I would say, the dialogical approach, but also the interactional epistemology Markova talks about. It's how like concepts change also with social representations, and putting in dialogue with the epistemic injustice debate frame or concept, as theorized by Amanda Fricker and also by Català very recently. My literature review is mostly about deaf studies, studying this kind of social object. Deaf studies is a discipline born in the 1960s, so there's a lot of literature already about the social construction of deafness, deaf epistemology, and in the background there are also other disciplines, of course. And ethnography means being there with people, doing things with people in Italy, because I work within the Italian Association of the Deaf. And in Canada, I might say it more of observing people doing things in public events. This is what the ethical committee suggested about my naming ethnography of this. And so also I attended public events, protests, and all this. So the first thing I did, not the first, but one of the things I did was to frame these legislative and legal principles in both countries. So dividing in general acts, meaning bigger laws that comprise all about accessibility, inclusion, and disability, what is to be deaf, what it means to be disabled, and all these specific laws that pertain to each country, and how these are inspired by some more higher principle, like master frames that are like more embedded with human rights, equity, that inform disability and other like documents about being the same in society, and other laws that define social benefits and employment and law. So then I went to the specific purpose of every important legislative act. I might say that Canada has a huge amount of legislative documents because they have also the indigenous issues, the Inuit part, the Métis part, so it's very, very big, and also they have many sign languages compared to Italy. But I can say that the main principles follow the same direction in different ways, because Canada has much more attention to minorities and to linguistic minority groups than Italy have, but they go in the same direction. So the comparison, I think it works. And I came up with some main social representations of being deaf, which are the medical and social model. Also, this morning there was a lecturer that mentioned these models, quite used and in disability studies, sociocultural model. And then I came up with my proposal of another model that I called inclusive perspective, which is, I think, a super hegemonic social representation that it mixes together the social and the medical and eats the polemic representations. So it's so powerful that it takes also the representation that try to subvert the hegemonic ones, but they are just embedded with naturalization and objectification, and they're embedded in the main ones. So this made a problem to be in a social movement that claim rights. So I did a thematic analysis, and okay, I will go fast. And some of the thematic analysis, I defined categories before the fieldwork, then I refined during the fieldwork according to what also the participants was telling me, where they led some of the conversation on some topics. One example would be education. I never mentioned education specifically, but it's a topic that came out so much, so I focused also on this personal experience of school, of university, and marginalization within the education structures. So now I want to focus on the results that come out that pertain to methodology, and I will show you a video, if I am able to show you.
I'm really happy that you're taking the time and wanting to learn and understand how Canada and how we manage our daily day.
Yes.
Of course, before COVID, we were always meeting up in person. But then COVID happened, that changed. So
I think her father is deaf, maybe?
Yes.
Okay. You see, now she's speaking. She's an indigenous deaf woman leading the most important association for the deaf in Canada, federal one.
The only issue is that, like, for example, if I wanted to help or anything, it's voluntary.
And you see how I mentioned Inuit deaf people, she becomes to speak and sign also to me, meaning I interpreted this as, okay, we are familiar in topics and conversations, so I will add also my way of communicating, which is the main one, even if she speaks very well. So this is interesting.
It's not.
This interview was directly in Italian Sign Language, so I could manage some interviews directly because let's say, skilled.
De parents sourds et des enfants entendants de parents sourds. Ah, culture sourde, je comprends qu'on a une culture sourde, mais moi,
I'm really happy that you're taking.
I don't know how to. Sorry, do you know how to? Perché sono tornato indietro. Just go, because I don't see the. Okay. Yes.
From here.
Yes. And that one was in Quebec, where there was an event, and you may see the deaf person speaking, signing Quebec Sign Language. There's a translation and also subtitles, just to show the complexity of communication.
viennent de parents sourds et des enfants entendants de parents sourds. Ah, culture sourde, je comprends qu'on a une culture sourde, mais moi, quand je vois ma fille entendante,
So you're the person to start this, and then I can share what I have to share.
Okay, around 27 years ago, or maybe 28 years ago,
Okay, we just let.
years ago,
In other provinces, they're working together as well to make sure that they're able to have more of that awareness. And in Ontario, we're working on it as hard as we can.
Quindi io comunque ho frequentato una scuola speciale con ragazzi sordi.
For particular events, but the diversity is much stronger here. In Italy, it is, I'm trying to think of the translation. It's not less, I'm trying to think of the translation to the sign.
So, just to show the different communication that happened, here is This last one is from Canada. She's deaf and she lives in Ontario, but I knew her because we met in Italy many years ago. And now she's asking me, she using Italian sign language, asking me, I had an interpreter, but she was translating in American sign language, she's asking me what she means with this sign. So it was quite funny at this time because the interpreter was cut out. She didn't understand anything, and it was just, she asking me what she meant. It was crazy. So, and then you see Italian sign language, informal and formal interviews with the girl that is laughing because I know her. And then we began the real interview with an interpreter. So I wanted to just separate the two dimensions. And also, one of the focus group, the interesting part is the crossing communication happening. I don't think you can have this in spoken language because otherwise you go other people, but you see like many conversations happening in Italian sign language because it's silent. So they don't interfere with someone speaking. So, okay, just go quick to what it means. So I think some of the results came out as a methodological reflection about all this data collected. One is the positionality, because deaf scholars are proposing and requesting more space for deaf perspective within this kind of discipline that I'm hearing. So what am I doing there? Am I taking space? So it raises an ethical concern. And also theoretical concern, is this my hearing perspective on a deaf topic? Am I understanding everything? Because language is a very important part in understanding the social processes happening. Also remembering that I'm co-constructing social reality with my participants. I'm not just taking some revealed truth and bringing in my notes. They are giving me what they think I want, and it's a guided process, as we know. But it was very, very interesting to observe. And also there are ethical, I was taking some suggestions from how you do Inuit, for example, or indigenous research in Canada. You have to advance Inuit governance. We can say you have to advance the deaf community if you make research with them. So you have to give them something back and build capacity and being aware also, because I have deaf indigenous in my research, so I need to be aware about all this. You need to gain trust, because it took me a lot of time to gain trust of people because they don't know me. I'm much more familiar with the Italian deaf community because I know people, I know interpreters, I know how it works, but there I spent I think 2 or 3 months trying to get in touch. Now I am in touch, so it's a quite also satisfaction process at the end. Language is an issue. How are you going to communicate? So you need to be aware that there are so many things happening in communication. And also I think I need to have a balance between what I know about deaf people, like what are the main prejudices I don't have to repropose, but also let the data talk, because otherwise it's like, okay, I know everything, what's the purpose of doing an interview? So it's a very delicate balance, trying to understand that every individual has its own history and experience, but also trying to take some rules that then apply to main concepts. So as Jodelet also pointed out, the languages in communication is very important because it works in the production, function, and efficacy of social representation. So I think that doing research with deaf people, it's highlighting the importance of language in how social representations are perceived, are performed, are distributed, because they provide a new reflection on diversity in forms of knowledge. So what it's useful to do is providing accessibility, of course, so using all speech and sign language if people use this, and also making sure that communication flows so there are not misunderstandings. And this can be seen in all the interviews where everyone was trying to be sure that the communication was flowing. So interpreter was looking at me, looking at a deaf person, so everybody was trying to do this. Also being aware of what the role of interpreters are, because they are there for translation, but they have a role, so they're not neutral, so you have to be aware of all this. And also providing translation about questionnaires, because not all the people can read with high skills, so we translated questions and all the videos, and as you can see another questionnaire. It's not in the research because I needed to cut, as Professor Sarika said many times, so this is not here, but we made some also questionnaire with Italian sign language, langue des signes français. So other things I may say, it's being aware of multimodality or language code switching, because people change their communication according also to the topic and who you are and how familiar you are with the topic and who familiar with you also. They adapt to your communication, so you need to be aware that this communication may change with someone else. And the transcription is a very big issue with this kind of interaction. I didn't use much. I tried to use en vivo. I did it for the main labels, the main coding, but then it's very difficult to note all the small things that happen in body, as Subhas was referring to what happens in the body language in a group, in a focus group. Here it happens a lot, so it's it becomes cold if you just write. And this goes also with free association of words. I tried to imagine, I wasn't able, because I spoke with deaf people and they said, we don't understand what you want, so I just gave up. It was impossible to do. I think there are limits with lexical, with skill in language, so it's something we have to be aware. So a little bit about main results are, I think, deaf people in this, all this data can come out with what I call the half polemic deaf and hard of hearing counter narrative that carries social representation, meaning they have a counter narrative in many different ways. It's half because it has limits that come from limited access to knowledge. So my idea is that they suffer testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, they are not considered valid interlocutors. When they propose something that changes their social policy, they are not really listened. They're not taken into account, but they are in some things. Like, okay, you want sign language? Here's your interpreter. So it always becomes an accessibility top-down model of translation, of translating something that it's already in the majority. You want access? This is access. It's not taking into account your own perspective. So this is, I think, the important part in how social representation theory and epistemic injustice frame may work together in a dialogue. Because the epistemic injustice shows also how some groups, in this case deaf people, they don't have equal access to how social representations are built. They lack pieces of symbolic repertoire. So even the polemic representations, I call it half, because it's weak. It's not a real polemic, because it's like trying to be a real polemic, but they don't have all the tools to make it so strong to be recognized as a polemic. So it's like, in some way, half. And what I find out in the general, I think I have to stop. People learn to navigate in different dimensions using social representations. They know how to deal with the macro institutional level. They know laws. They know how to get benefits. So this is one, like, cognitive polyphagia, a smart cognitive polyphagia. They know how to mix the middle level, like doing activities in organizations, and also the personal view they have as a personal individual who experiences deafness. I think I have to stop. So the conclusion is, focusing on the access to knowledge, yes, they might find marginalized group, they might find the way, but they can cross the river okay, they crossed, but there's still the river flowing, so it's still full of problems. And I just want to end with something from the interviews, like from Paula. She's also another woman from indigenous tribe and very active in the social community and indigenous community. And she says, I'm struggling to let indigenous, like non-deaf, know deaf indigenous people issues because they have their own battles. So they already have their limited like epistemic fence in which they struggle, which means they don't have access to their culture, indigenous, they don't have access to the main Canadian English-speaking culture because of how the schools are organized. On the other side of the deaf community does not know indigenous cultures, trauma, healing processes, the truth and revitalization process. So we have these two dimensions that they struggle together. So this is to say that identity as an intersectionality is not built just adding layers to identity, but there's a very strong tension in these labels, and it's not easy to claim indigenous or deaf as they like. Like some people, they know how to do, but others are just left in the marginalized part of society. Thank you. I don't know how, I think I was very long in time.
No, but I have done this afternoon,
okay.
so no problem.
Okay, so finally, if there are any questions, comments? There's no more energy. You may have one.
Yeah, but it's not. I have one question, but it's not on the focus of the presentation. So, it's regarding comparison because you said why Italian and Canada are quite close to each other. But mostly when you want to compare, there is also research question or strategy, the methodological design, or need for doing comparison. And my question is, what was your objective when you wanted to compare these two contexts?
Yeah, I think I just focus on the legal and legislative communality, but actually it's more than this. Like every country has its own association of the deaf, main one, and they, both in Canada and Italy, they all belong to the World Federation of the Deaf. So there's a huge umbrella and their activities go together in this. What I was interested in finding is, because there's a strong literature that speaks about being deaf as being the same. Like being deaf is a main identity, like 50 years of literature. I think that now someone is trying to break this narrative because they're beginning to question, okay, this being deaf goes beyond every other identity. No, some new papers, new research is saying that every deaf experience is one. But there's still this deaf same. So I was trying to understand in these two countries, which are similar for some parts, but very, very different in history, geography, and social composition, how these two, the subjective, the individual, and the collective dimension go. They reflect what the literature say, they reflect it in another way. And I think they do it in quite the same way, but Canada is much, much more into the respecting of the multicultural diversity and language, at least in the formal policies. In real life, like every time I ask this difference between real life, they say, okay, you're right. But I was trying to see the individual and collective according to the literature in deaf studies, if this was what was coming out from the data. So this was connected to the research question. I hope I answered.
I might have myself a question about your presentation, especially the last part. Did you notice some factors that can explain why some of your participants were thinking about their struggles, identity in terms of intersectionality, and why, for some reasons, it was not all the time the case?
Can you repeat?
There's some social factors that made some deaf people thinking about their identity in terms of intersectionality.
Okay. Yeah, I targeted mostly deaf leaders that work in deaf-led organization in different dimensions. In Italy, it's much less than like 2 or 3 organizations. One is the main one and the other are very small. In Canada, it's much bigger because of the hugeness also of the country. And I knew that there was a mixing of identities. So I knew there was a Black deaf community, so I had interviews with Black deaf people and of course and deaf indigenous people, and I was interested in seeing how these labels and how they were speaking about themselves connected to deaf identity or being indigenous or being Black or being artist or being, and I mean, the interesting part, there's no one answer. I think it's like what comes out as a main result is complexity. Like it's very difficult to say it's like this. Yes, you can, but I will need to, but you need to remind that this is one of the and there's a woman I interviewed from the Black deaf community. She said, I cannot speak about all the Black deaf community, so okay. and most of the time they speak about their experience. That's why they come out with the education part, because it's the part where they struggle most. And it's like, but I did it. Like, even if I didn't have access to school, to knowledge, I had trauma and all this and that, I did it and now I can speak. And usually the deaf leaders that are also identifying other sub-parts of the Canadian culture, in Italy less, but in Canada is much more, they focus the energy on the weakest part, which is the indigenous deaf or the Black deaf. Like, it's not about the deaf community. What they do is trying to sensitize, bringing information about the deaf indigenous to the deaf community, which it's not informed about the other. So it was, wow, very also, I mean, it was very impacting. Some of the interviews were very, very strong. I spoke with people working in palliative care in hospitals for deaf people, and it was, okay. But it was very interesting to see how complexity, but also the individual experience comes out much more in Canada, while in Italy they speak much more about us. It's more about we deaf people. In Italy it was much more about me. But there's this deaf sameness, because it's in the literature and it's in what we have to claim as the individual people to have rights. So there are so many dimensions together, but there's a coherence into this. Maybe I got lost, but
Fascinating.
okay. Yeah, it is.
There.
I don't know how to close it.
The last communication.
Close. Ne pas enregistrer.
hopefully that part will go off. I'm not sure. Okay. Ah, sì. Perfetto, ottimo. Così. Grazie. Andavo via. Grazie.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me good? It's okay? So, my name is Giacomo. I'm concluding now my first year in the Joint International PhD. Today, I would like to present to you the advancement of my research. This is both the title of my research project and today's presentation. And I will go through... Okay. I will go through what is the topic of my research, what are my goals, my ideas, and the theoretical framework that I have been studying. Then I will present to you the design of this past first year with 2 studies that I have completed, and then for the future what I plan to do the next year, and hopefully much more with your feedback and suggestions. So, the title of, as you may have seen, is Photojournalism and Vulnerability. And of course, I have to make some clarification starting this presentation because I would like to focus on a specific, viewpoint when we think about and look to vulnerability. My concept of vulnerability focuses on the physical body of social individuals and especially at the vulnerable body at times of war. That's why in this first slide you can see some elements that are quite graphic already, but are the main topic of my research, researching how both wounded bodies and dead bodies can actually communicate something going beyond the traditional or Western narcissistic, we will see more of that later, but viewpoints that don't add anything to humanitarian or empathetic communication. Also, I would like to focus, and I've already done that a little bit, on the concept of precarity of life, which plays a huge part when we think about the reality of war or humanitarian crisis. And here we have a citation from Julia Racchi and Stolich, which is very important for my research, because the visual enactment of vulnerability and bodily exposure to suffering and death can actually tell us very much about the life of individuals and their actual experiences and bodily experiences. The final goal of this research could be the last sentence I've added here, because there are both potentialities and risks when we talk about humanitarian and war photography, but we have to select a frame to look upon humanitarian photography and actually tend towards a visual and representative storytelling. The main social issue of my research and of this topic is actually the literature about vulnerability and how us individuals that look at atrocity or vulnerable visual representation tend to perceive vulnerability as a state of passivity and inactivity. Combined with the logic of the news media, press or digital journalism, of course we have to think about the spectacularization, banalization, sentimentalization of the news, which doesn't add anything to the humanitarian part of the message that the photograph actually wants to convey. So, the main focus of my research would be the photojournalistic representations of vulnerable bodies, which are actually the main social issue, because as a lot of literature has pointed out, this representation tend to fall into a spiral of re-victimizing, desensitizing, but also alienating, traumatizing, and weaponizing these bodies that we want to look at. The idea is both to study the communication and representational strategies to depict vulnerable bodies, but also how this representation can actually promote identification and social acknowledgement. In the end, I would like to propose new strategies to engage in a storytelling that not only is visual and representative of the lives that we are talking about, but is also respectful and actively involving these individuals, making them protagonists and not sub-agents. This is the theoretical framework that I've been building up, and as you can see, I'm going for a circular approach. We will see why it becomes later dialogical. But of course, the main focus and reference of my research is visual sociology. We know images are a very important part of sociology. They are the first impact we make with the world. They can be used by individuals to affirm their identity, their belonging, diversity. They have to be looked upon as sociological data, true sociological data, capable of constructing social knowledge, diffusing social meanings, primary source of information, and also, as Ciampi said, a synoptic vision of social matters, not only simultaneous and immediate, but also synoptic. Also, the last citation by Harper is the main focus of what I would like to do, because especially documentary photography, a photograph that is void of articulations, artistic interpretation, can actually tell us a lot about social meaning, both from the photographer point of view and both of the individuals. Communication is another fundamental part of my research. A lot of academics and researchers have thoughts about the humanitarian potential of visual photography, and this kind of communication has risen up in the last few years, unfortunately and sadly, because of the state of the world and international politics. But the main focus is once again Giulia Racchi, because sometimes a visual state of vulnerability, but also victimhood, can be turned into an actual weapon that individuals can both take into their hand or use upon other individuals, especially in the news media universe. Lastly, social representations theory can actually help me a lot if we want to investigate both the potential of the image as an expressive vehicle of social representation, but also of meanings and context and knowledge. But if we have to look at images as additional communicative code that can help all the processes that the theory suggests us, but also a figurative, representative, and symbolic potential of the image. Not only the immediacy yet is very important, but also the emotional potential of the image in being able to attach new phenomena and new emotions to the ones we already have within ourselves. That is why I would like to focus on a dialogical approach. Here I've inserted two citations by Markova and Molinet, which have helped me very much constructing this theoretical background. But in the end, the question is actually very simple, because images help us both in building social shared meanings and also social representation. So having these three disciplines, theory, communicate with each other, it's the best way for me to look at both the humanitarian and emotional potential of the photograph, but also at the sociological or, very much academic potential of the actual study of the photographs. The main goals I've tried to go to invest in this first year was to redirect the communication of vulnerable bodies towards an approach of dignification and de-victimization, and also go beyond the traditional viewpoint of communication and visual communication, which is a lot of the times paternalistic or as we would say colonial. We will see that later with one of the studies. But the main goal of this PhD in general, I think that is the most difficult part to define, but I think that building up and developing a theoretical paradigm uniting the social representation theory, communication and visual sociology can both update the picture on humanitarian photography, but also fill a gap that during this year I feel like it's very consistent. In general about images, but most of all about documentary photographs, which are very much, graphic and hard to look at. This is the research design. As I said, I proceeded with an extensive review of the literature, trying to, find which theories, approaches, methods can help me. And I've also tried, as I said, to investigate the role of both the three disciplines in my, research design. And now I would like to briefly mention these two studies that I've completed. I would not go very much in depth. I just want to, tell you how these preliminary two studies helped me understand how I can use all that I've said in my research. The first study was a thematic analysis of two full photo reportages from Ukraine, from two international photographers, photojournalists actually. One was Carol Guzzi from the United States and the other Alfredo Bosco from Italy. And then I compared and combined this thematic analysis with a thematic and discourse analysis about 8 cover pages of the New York Times. The main goal of the study was to investigate the possibility to use the photograph to make demands of peace and justice, and looking at images as true documents, true testimonies, able to help both researchers but also authorities, legals, citizens, everyone trying to make sense of the war and the crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed. The time frame was from February 2022, the start of the invasion, until September 2022. The inclusion criteria were very, maybe basic, being the first study that I've done, but they were very strict because I wanted to look at explicit images depicting blood, dead bodies, pain, also, desperation, everything that can explicitly reveal the tragedy of the war. But also I wanted to include all civilians and the effect that this invasion has had on civilians. And I focused on two of the most tragic events of the war, as we all know, which were the crimes committed in Bucha and Izium, and also the positioning of the journal, the newspaper, in this case the New York Times, and some citation from interviews of the two photojournalists helped me investigate the professional engagement of the professionals in documenting, aiming to reveal and denounce the atrocity of the war. The results were very clear because there is a tendency to use documentary photographs to sensitize the public, raise awareness or mobilize action, but also visual testimonies are being used more and more, also thanks to social media and extreme capillarization of the image to make demands of peace and justice. But in this specific case, the images were actively used by authorities to identify corpses, to arrest individuals that committed the crimes, and it was very much a collaboration between both journalists and photojournalists and legal authorities and medical authorities. The second study was very much similar, at least on the same wave of the first study. It was a thematic, interpretative and comparative analysis of 76 photographs taken by 9 professional photojournalists. And in this case, I only analyzed the photographs. I didn't interview or took articles. I wanted to do a classical, in scores, visual analysis, and I wanted to investigate if there are new and maybe more respectful photojournalistic practices and representational strategies to depict distant suffering. In this case, once again, in the war in Ukraine. The time frame this time was much longer because I ended up in July 2024, and the inclusion criteria were more explicit than the last study, the first study, because not only I wanted to portray the effects of the war on civilians, but I wanted to see if the explicit portrayal of death, of strikes and clashes can actually communicate something other than compassion or rage or, you know, sometimes a banalized version of humanitarian communication. This time I wanted to look at the professional engagement through the photographs. So I selected photographs that both shocked the observer and also provided journalistic storytelling. So photos not only with a shock value, but also able to capture your gaze and communicate something in a news, I don't know how to say, in a news kind of way. The results were very optimistic in my opinion, because there seems to be a trend to a more dignified and de-victimizing approach, and this is clear when we look at the technical elements of the image of the sample, at least. There are imperfect photographic composition, there are a lot of details, extreme close-ups and close-up, which link this discourse to the first studies, because a lot of the times these extreme close-ups were used also to identify bodies and give justice to these bodies. Also, there is a tendency to engage in a non-artistic perspective. We may see tilted images that are not perfect, we may see unfocused images, so we can deduct that the photographers were not interested in capturing a beautiful or perfect photograph, but on documenting the moment. I identified 3 common approaches that showed the professional ethics and commitment to a more sustainable war communication, which were a focus on the victim, a documentary approach, and a humanitarian potential. And these 3 approaches may actually be a summary of this all I've said today, because a focus on the victim refers to you know, a natural shot of the images, a very realistic image that shows, unfortunately, again, all the atrocity inflicted on the body. Documentary approach, as I've said, I will not repeat again, and a humanitarian potential that both shocks the viewer, but also can raise questions about humanitarian, you know, laws or commitment or engagement. And also question, you know, our role in promoting this kind of communication, or, you know, in asking for peace and justice again. The end of this study tells us that although victims are always, can't always act on their agency if they are wounded, if they are dead, these images, these particular images of the study tend to celebrate their resilience, their identity, their bodies. A lot of the times there were reconstructions of the lives of the victims photographs. For example, photographers shot photos and then tried to relocate the family, ask who this woman was, why was she here, so a real reportage. But also, and this is useful if we want to link this study to the theory, the objectification of the traumatic experience can also be used to any future study, or also, you know, memorial practices, respectful practices. This is the more or less complete design of what I want to do the next year. I will focus on the dialogical approach that I presented today, but also I would like to investigate these three concepts: lived experience, embodied precarity, but also, and most important, I think I am interested in trying to find a link between the two conceptions that there seems to be about empathy, one in communication and one in social psychology. So I would love to see if this concept can be integrated in both theories, and if it can be used in a similar way, or, you know, find some way to make it work. That is the main point of this third point. But also, I should start on participatory research, which is the main, most important part of this research, as I am expecting to create a paradigm for, you know, a respectful representation and visual empathy. The least I can try to do is directly involve the individuals in the research to grant them visibility, voice, and representativeness. I would love to do that through visual methods like photo elicitation, photo voice, maybe citizen photojournalism. And I would also love to investigate the positioning and ethics of the photojournalists, maybe through interviews, through focus groups or questionnaires. But in general, reflecting on the participatory part of the methods or the approach is important to understand how individuals experience this condition of vulnerability, supposed condition of vulnerability, but also if and how they feel represented by the visual representations that I take into consideration. And the ultimate research goal, which I hope to reach, is to investigate the sociological and representational mechanism that actually dictate who are the bearers of such condition, and if and how we can work together to promote a new visual and representative storytelling. I think that is all. I thank you for your attention.
Questions? Okay, thank you. It's very rich. Sometimes a bit too much. So first comment is maybe you still have to clean a little bit, so to focus and to give more depth into some of the many things that you're putting on the table now. As you may know, I also teach peace psychology and network capital. So, I mean, it's a debate that is around, so I think it's perfectly focused and very interesting. I have some concern, but I'll try to point out to the first one. Maybe they're connected. The first one is about that you introduced this concept of vulnerability. That, in my opinion, either you put a question mark at the end. So, are these perceived as vulnerable? Because, you know, I don't know what happened when I will be dead, but I imagine that once I'm dead, I'm no more vulnerable. Second, we actually don't know if the intention of the author has to do with vulnerability. So it could be a research question, rather than assuming that the bodies are vulnerable. We may wonder if looking at these bodies makes me feel more vulnerable, or in the attention of the photographer, the photograph, the still life, see here, as the aid or the pragmatic aid to stress vulnerability. So, or the community is vulnerable. There are very interesting papers by Vincze on the effect of being in a victimized community. So also torturing a dead body has something to do with the effect that you want to have on the community, on the group. So, as I was saying, this issue of vulnerability is tricky if you put it as an assumption. It could be a result, maybe. And again, connected with this, as you see, that it's important to clarify the distinction between the intention that you might interpret or you might investigate, the content. Is it victimhood? Is it collective victimhood? What kind of content? And then maybe the effect. On this third point is something that maybe also was there. There is a strong ethical concern, because if you want to use this kind of images, especially if you want to use them to interview a focus group, well, I would strongly suggest to go to a ethical committee.
Yes.
Because it may arise, you don't know if the people that come to your focus group come from Bosnia, and maybe no, they have experienced this, or they have family narratives about this, or from Sant'Anna di Stazzema, to stay in Italy, no? Where people were slapped. So this bit of clarification, I think, is useful.
Yeah. Should I answer or?
I don't know, if you have an answer.
No.
Or you collect the comment.
Collect. Okay.
Question, the themes is very interesting, very focused on our picture culture, so important. And I think I guess I will same concern, the first concern on that I think it's very hard to explain the meaning of the photo, focusing only on the content of it. Usually, the real meaning is constructed by the side of the photo, what you tell before and after, the narrative. Same photo can mean different meaning in different contexts and narrative. Same photo of migrants in Lampedusa can express fear or sadness if there is a different framing. So I suggest you to insert this dimension, the dimension of the story embedded, in which the photo is embedded, and the paratextual element, the content, the text used to share on internet or to publish in New York Times, etc. So I think it's useful for you to enrich your analysis.
Thank you.
I have three considerations. One is about there is a kind of morality inside communication that you also mentioned, to desensitize, for example, right? If you have all the time images of war and of that, I think that people are not able to elaborate on that. So the quantity or the quality of communication which is what happens with that quantity or that quality. The second that you mentioned is about that you find out that these photos are becoming more realistic or less artistic somehow. And my question is, can we add new artistic style, you know, to become more realistic, which is not anymore the photographer creation, but a good document of what's happening, you know, so that's a motivation. And I like, you know, for example, yeah, you want to be a good photographer presenting the realistic, and that's a new artistic style. And the third, it was about methodology. When you say they become more realistic, how you measure them, how you see them, because you look into the photos or you are following some kind of coding of the images, and that's
it. I will go backwards. So, quantity or quality is the ultimate question, because the risk of desensitization is behind the corner, and that is maybe a good, you know, source to do something. But regarding the method, I did a qualitative analysis, so no coding, no collecting, no selecting. I just searched for the photographs. I had a much bigger sample, but in the end I selected the ones that were the most graphic of them all. That was one of the only few parameters. I haven't yet engaged in a quantitative or any kind of coded analysis. And also the question of realism, that could be behind all of that, because, you know, the more real, the more true, the more document it is. So it's a qualitative evaluation. We will never know unless the photographer tells us if that photo was taken in a rush while running away, or studied and he told people to go there and smile or run. So that is an ethical question too, and I will try and reflect on that. Regarding only the visual part, yes, of course. That's why I also want not only, you know, textual, verbal text, but also try to integrate the human component. So maybe how the photograph is seen or assimilated, but also, I haven't considered that much this part, so thank you. And that leaves me to the biggest concern of the research, which are two actually, because the concept of vulnerability is one thing, and also the ethical part is another. Regarding the concept, I try to, it was in the slide, I didn't say it out loud. I try to, make the ground smaller and have the vulnerable bodies as object of research. Having vulnerability which means for the wounded body, of course, the physical state, but putting it for the dead bodies as a matter of agency or dignity. That is more or less the direction I want to go to. But the suggestion to investigate the status, who gives this status to these people, could be also interesting. But at the same time, I think that focusing on the image, willing or not, the image has become an object. So at least looking at image as a cultural object, we can see that the state of the individual is fixed in the photograph. So my idea was to assume the picture as a depiction of vulnerability, and then present this state to people and have them react to that.
This way, you lose an opportunity. because if you take this, sorry, I don't want to take that, but I think it's important
Mhm.
now, especially for students in the first year. If you take a conservative stance, of course you will find photos that confirm your assumption. So if you start with the idea that it's a photo about vulnerability, you will find something that will confirm your own vision of vulnerability. In my opinion, it's more interesting, for example, in this slide, the third line, dead bodies. So, photos of dead bodies at war, in a specific situation, in a specific framing.
Okay.
Do I identify in sample? That you can also answer as how many, how elements that the theory tell me are related to moral infringement, for example, or vulnerability of the physical or the mental. Or in this way, I'm not saying you have to put vulnerability away, but it's a research question,
Mm-hmm.
and you are actually working on photos of dead bodies, which is quite objective. I think you can talk about social construction of reality. If I find that dignity, for example, is preserved or not, and you have to verify how you find it, then you can conclude something about and imagine that this will elicit perceived vulnerability. And then you move to the next phase and say, after that, look at this. And then you try to understand if people talk about vulnerability or they talk about, I don't know, Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
Sorry if I took you as an
example.
In the case, but it's a common problem when we are planning the research.
Just regarding images, there's all the work of the Finnish colleagues, but also from Joaquim Valentine,
Mm-hmm.
who analyzes images of colonial period, etc. And I think it would also be very helpful to look at how they analyze them. And of course, there's a special issue in papers and social presentations, which is a very, very good issue as well, about images and social presentations. I think also be very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.